Some people invent their own imaginary friends. Mine was created for me. When we were younger, my parents would leave for a week at a time, and an older retired couple would come and act as our surrogate parents for that week. And we loved, even though they were not related, we loved Auntie Betty and Uncle Stuart. Auntie Betty would cook our meals for us. She'd make our lunches every day, and she'd hug us when we got home from school. She'd even help with our homework. She treated us like she was our grandmother, and we loved it, and we loved her. Uncle Stuart told us, regaled us of stories, amazing adventures that he'd had around the world. It seems like when he was younger, he was a great traveler. And we looked forward to every time they came to visit us. One year, Uncle Stuart suffered a stroke. We didn't think we'd really ever see them again. But soon enough, Auntie Betty and Uncle Stuart came to look after us for another week. Now, Uncle Stuart's physical therapy regimen was to walk. Our property was 26 acres, mostly vineyard. We grew sultana grapes, and every year we harvested them and we dried them to make raisins. And we had the most amazing group of fruits and nuts. We had 7 almond trees. We had the largest walnut tree you have ever seen. We had oranges, mandarins, asparagus, wine grapes, and currants, just to name a few of them. And because we were on a vineyard and we were surrounded by vineyards, there wasn't a lot of traffic on the road. So Uncle Stuart would walk to the end of the road every day as part of his therapy. It was about a quarter mile or so. And he invited my brother John and I along to walk with him, and we jumped at the chance because we wanted to hear more of his incredible and amazing stories. And at the end of the street, on the other side of the T-junction, was an abandoned car amongst the bushes. This car was a late 1940s Humber Hawk, and it was sort of a post-war boxy British vehicle that looked like the Rolls-Royce that every family could afford. But it had been there so long, it was only now just a body, no wheels, no engine. And John and I used to go around to all the abandoned cars near our house in the bush, and we would steal all the emblems and the knobs and buttons that we could find. We just loved all the colors and the shapes and the car makes. And the Humber was so close, it was plundered very, very early. So it was pretty bare. But Uncle Stuart didn't care about the bits and pieces. He told us a story about the witch who lived in the Humber. And her name was Mrs. McGillicuddy. And he told us we would never see her for 2 reasons. The first is, of course, she was a witch. And the second was she was always somewhere traveling around the world plying her witch trade. And he warned us to be very careful of not disturbing Mrs. McGillicuddy's house, the Humber. Of course, John and I were frightened by this, but we were quite excited, so we asked lots of pressing questions. Was she a dangerous witch? Did she fly on a broom? Would she put a spell on us boys? How old was she really? Uncle Stuart's answers were just deflections, and so Mrs. McGillicuddy remained quite a mystery. A couple of weeks after Auntie Betty and Uncle Stuart left for that visit, we'd sort of forget about Mrs. McGillicuddy. She'd fade into the distance. Until one day we got home from school, and Mum was holding a letter addressed to John and I, and she asked why we were receiving a letter postmarked from Auckland, New Zealand. Now, in those days, getting any kind of mail was pretty cool. But getting a letter from overseas when we lived 6 hours north of Melbourne in the middle of the Australian bush was a treat. And Mum was very curious, so we opened it up. There was one sheet of paper in it. We unfolded it, and on one side, there was a lot of strange patterns and a foreign language. That was very confusing, so on closer inspection, we realized that the foreign language was backwards English. And it started in the middle of the page and went in a circle around and around until it reached the edges of the paper. So we got a mirror and we were able to read this letter very slowly. And it was from Mrs. McGillicuddy. And then occasionally we would receive other letters postmarked from all over the world, from different cities. We got letters from the US, from the UK, from Canada. We even got one from Hong Kong. This was very, very cool. And everyone would tell a story about Mrs. McGillicuddy's adventure in that particular location. We just got excited. Every time we got home, there was a new letter. We were just transfixed. But it was a one-way conversation. There was no return address. We thought long and hard about this imaginary friend. So we asked Mum, what do you know about these letters? And she denied vehemently anything to do with these letters. We thought we'd ask Auntie Betty. And she said, I know nothing about those letters. We thought something was up, so we pressed her. She said, I don't know anything about a silly old witch in an abandoned car at the end of your street. Now, we thought maybe Uncle Stuart wrote these letters, but with his paralysis, he probably couldn't have done it. And so for a long time, John and I thought that Mrs. McGillicuddy was real, and she was a real friend of Uncle Stuart's, and that she wrote these letters. I graduated college and I moved to the US and became an IT consultant. And every year I would go back home to Australia and I would go visit that home of my youth. And every time I saw that place, I would have a sense of calm and a sense of just being at home. And I would see the Humber at the end of the street and I would have fond memories of Uncle Stuart, Auntie Betty, and Mrs. McGillicuddy. But of course, life doesn't follow rules and it upends your best laid plans. And so I went through a dark period. I suffered a quite difficult separation and a divorce. And I survived it, but I got out the other end and I said, I've got to find myself again. I've got to work out who I am. And in that process, I discovered that I needed to go back home and find the youth that I was and reconnect the youth with who I was today to complete myself. So after 5 years of being away, I went home, flew into Melbourne, got on the hour flight to my hometown, and when I got there, I went out to this property, and everything was razed to the ground. No house, no outlying buildings, no orchard, no vineyard, just empty. Just 26 acres of a field of red dirt. And down at the end of the street, nothing. No bushes and no Humber, just nothing. And I wondered for a little while where Mrs. McGillicuddy really was. Maybe the Humber was just the back door to an underground lair and she found her way into her house other ways these days. I got back home to the US and I realized that this whole thing had affected me. In fact, all my childhood memories were gone. Every time one was triggered, I would see a field of red dirt. And I thought about this for quite a while, and I realized that I really did not have to connect with the youth that I was because I was already the sum of all my experiences that made me up in my life. I was already whole. I was complete. And then I got all my memories flooding back, and I remembered Mrs. McGillicuddy again. So I flew home the next year, and I landed in Melbourne, and I got on the plane to go to my hometown, and there was an older lady in the seat next to me. I said hello, and she was a little wary of me. I can understand that. I had a ponytail down the middle of my back and looked a bit like a miscreant who did not belong in the middle of the Australian bush. We didn't say anything to each other, but when we landed, I held her hand to let her down the stairs to the tarmac. And as we were walking across to the greeting area, I could see my mum smiling and waving, and I was so pleased to see her after this time just a year. And as we approached, she made a beeline straight to my seatmate and reached up, gave her a big hug and said, "Hello, Betty? And for a moment I was confused. Turns out this was my very own Auntie Betty. We had not spoken a word. I gave my mum a hug, and Auntie Betty gave me a great hug, and we talked a little bit. She commented on my ponytail. I apologized profusely for not talking with her. And before the bags came, we had a few minutes to catch up, and I told how fondly I remembered the times that Uncle Stuart and Auntie Betty came and looked after us kids. I said, but we have one unanswered question. And that is, you and Mum denied knowing anything about the letters, and we know Uncle Stuart didn't write them because we found out later that he was sending them to those places in the world and having his friends mail them to us. And she smiled, and there was a twinkle in her eye. And I will remember Auntie Betty's next words forever. She looked at me and she said, I hope you enjoyed all of my letters. And that was the first and last time I ever met the real Mrs. McGillicuddy.